I was hoping Don and Jim would back up, but you've been forewarned, right? Was that prepared? You've been taking your vitamin D and your all, all that good stuff. I do, but I guess mine don't work. I don't know what it is. Well, even if you take vitamin D, if you have a 6-year-old cough in your face, I don't know how effective. You can only do so much. You know what I mean? And last week I had the flu. I've never had the flu before. I talked to my mom today. I said, "Did I ever have strep as a kid?" She said, "I don't think so." And I've had two in the last 2 weeks. And you know what it is? Children. That's what it is. Yeah. Yeah. I thought I was like young and healthy and had this great immune system. No, I shouldn't have kids. And when I did, they didn't go to school. This is Emmett's first year in school, and kid catches everything. And so, I'll tell you a story. And so we had the marriage retreat last week, and it was great. Appreciate Skylar and Bailey and them putting that together. And so Emmett had the flu, and I was coming off the flu, so I wasn't like contagious or anything, I don't think, when I was at the marriage retreat. And we had a couple members come down with it at the retreat, but that wasn't for me, I'm pretty sure. At least I'm not taking the blame for it. And but about 3 days before we were leaving for the marriage retreat, Brittany and I, we don't leave the kids very much. I mean, Emmett's 6. We've been away from home like 5 nights in his life. 3 of those is when Gia was born. And so, I mean, he's kind of a mama's boy, like he cries when we're not home. And so he knows he's sick with the flu, and he crawls up in Brittany's lap and coughs as hard as he can right in her mouth. And I was like, "What are you doing?" He was like, "I don't want y'all to leave." And so it's like, that is the sweetest, meanest thing you could possibly do, is try to give your mom the flu so she can't leave you for one night with grandma. I mean, come on now. And so, but there's a lot going around, and it's good to see some of you back who've been sick the last couple of weeks, and hope the rest of you wash your hands and stay fever-free and all that good stuff too. And so tonight we're going to be beginning a new study, and I've been wanting to do this study for several years, and I'm really, really excited about it. And we're going to be looking at Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and also 1st Chronicles. And what this is going to do is this is going to take us from the end of the Judges, the birth of Samuel, 150 years to the death of David. And so a lot of what happens in 2nd Samuel and 1st Chronicles are the same, told from a little bit different perspective. And so a lot of times whenever we get to like 2nd Samuel, we'll be bringing in some of 1st Chronicles too. But I think it's going to be a really good study. And my goal is for us to get through this 150 years, then look at the life of Solomon and the United Kingdom, and then to go through like 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings, and looking at basically the history of the nation of Israel from the establishment with Samuel and Saul all the way to the Babylonian captivity. So I think that would be a really cool study, because sometimes I know for many people that's kind of confusing. And so if y'all remember from about 4 or 5 years ago, we did an intertestamental study. And so it's going to be kind of like that, but using the Bible as our base text and not, the writings of, Alexander's generals and Josephus and things of that nature, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. We'll be using the actual biblical text. This is going to be kind of like a mixture between a Bible class and a history class. And don't get too scared about that. Some people don't like history. History is just stories. And if the person tells a story good enough, anybody can like that. And I'll try to do the best I can when it comes to that, about telling these stories, these biblical accounts, these biblical stories in a way that's engaging, entertaining, but also enlightening spiritually. And so I hope you'll be gracious with me as I strive to do that. And so Samuel and 1st Chronicles. And so we may ask ourselves, what's the date? What are we looking at here on this time frame? Well, we're looking at roughly 1120 BC until 970 BC. 1120 is roughly the year in which Samuel was born. That's what Samuel begins at in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And then it's going to end in roughly 970 with the death of David. So what we've been doing on Wednesday nights previously is we looked at the Judges and also Ruth. And so in our previous class, we basically went from about 1400 all the way to about 1100 when looking at the Judges. and talking about those guys like Othniel and Shamgar and Gideon and Barak and those types of guys. And we also talked about Ruth. Ruth and Boaz also happens during that same time frame of the Judges. And here we're going to basically close that chapter and start a new one, because Samuel is the last judge. So if you go through the book of Judges and you think that you have finished the Judges, you're wrong. There's actually two more judges. Eli, who is called a judge, and also Samuel. Samuel is an interesting individual because Samuel is actually a priest, a prophet, and a judge. And so you can see in Jeremiah 15, verse 1, when God is talking about the heavy hitters in the nation of Israel. We mentioned this, I believe, last week also, or the last time I taught class. In Jeremiah 15:1, God mentions two people when talking to Jeremiah. He mentions Moses and Samuel. Moses is the one who gives the law. Samuel is the one who gives the Davidic kingdom, right? And so while we may not think of Samuel very often as being, one of the primary individuals of the Old Testament, he is. And so he is one of the primary individuals, and you can see that in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And so who wrote this? And so we're told in 1 Chronicles 29:29 that there are actually three writers. There's Samuel the seer, and that means prophet. The records of Nathan. If you remember Nathan the prophet, Nathan is the one who goes to David whenever he has committed adultery with Bathsheba. And you remember the prophet comes in and tells David the story about the ewe lamb. Remember that? And Nathan convicts him. That's Nathan. And then Gad is also a prophet that is there that we're going to be reading about in 2 Samuel and also in 1 Chronicles. And so we see these three are the writers. That's mentioned in 1 Chronicles 29:29. It says, as for the events of King David's reign from beginning to end, they are written in the records of Samuel the seer, the records of Nathan the prophet, and the records of Gad the seer. And so what about this time frame? What's kind of going on? And so I think it's very important for us to talk about the setting. So oftentimes if you read a play, one of the first things that you'll do is you'll read Act 1, and then it'll set the scene. Because if you can't see what the scene is, the dialogue and the activities of the individuals within that writing is not going to make sense. So this class is kind of for us just to kind of get our footing and think about what is going on. Because if you don't really understand what is going on in Israel at this time, you're not really going to understand what you're reading in 1st and 2nd Samuel and also 1st Chronicles, right? And it's really important for you to envision a really dark and terrible time. Okay, that's what the Bible talks about in the book of Judges. It's also what it talks about a little bit in the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth doesn't really spell it out as well, but it is referenced. Now, the book of Judges really hits it hard. 7 times in the book of Judges, we're told that the people forsook God and worshipped idols. And 3 times in the very beginning, the very middle, and the very end of Judges, it says the people did what was right in their own eyes, right? So think about just in a really, really terrible time. There's anarchy. There's infighting. It's just really, really bad. However bad you can think of it is, it's worse than that. You're like, Isaac, you're laying it on a little thick. Go read Judges 19 to refresh yourself and tell me if I'm laying it on thick, okay? If you don't remember Judges 19, that's where the man takes his concubine and cuts her up into 12 parts and sends her out to the 12 parts of Israel. And they all get together and then decimate the tribe of Benjamin and kill everybody except for like 300 guys from Gilboa. Okay, so yeah, it's worse than you can imagine. Okay, and so when we begin the book of Samuel, the tribes are divided. They're fragmented. Okay, there's no central government. There is no leading tribe. There are no leading figures. You have Eli, who is the priest at Shiloh, but he's a terrible priest and a terrible father, and his sons are awful. And so there really is no central government. There's no leader. And when you read the book of Judges, even when God raises up a judge for the people, the success doesn't last very long. Sometimes they have peace for a few years, sometimes as much as 20 years, but it never lasts. The judge dies, the judge becomes corrupt, the nation is overthrown again by the oppressors from around, typically from the north, south, and the east. Now, when you get to Gideon, he talks about, not Gideon, when you get to Samson, we kind of get introduced to the Philistines, who are going to be a major player in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So there is no centralized government. During the period of the Judges, the Hebrew tribal groups had settled in their territories. Everyone kind of shared the land's resources. There was no really leadership. There was no king. There was no standing army that was ready to defend them. There was no real sense of uniformity or no organization, right? And if you're living during a time frame whenever people are abusing you, they're attacking you, there's no leadership, there's no organization, there's no king, there's no army, you can see how it feels like a very negative time, right? A very hopeless situation. So you have to think about that, right? If you don't understand how hopeless the people of Israel are, you're not going to understand what takes place in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now, we give the Israelites a really hard time when we read 1st Samuel, but I don't think oftentimes we think about just really how bad it is, right? And so we're introduced to a new group of people. Now, these have been mentioned both in the book of Genesis, but also they've been mentioned in the book of Judges when it comes to with Samson. And this is the Philistines. Now, the Philistines are a really important group, okay? And so the Philistines have been on the coast for generations, but they're starting to move into the interior and dominate Israel. If you read the book of Judges, there's a lot talked about the Midianites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Jebusites, right? There's a little bit of mention of the Philistines, but not very much. It's really those individuals, really kind of the north of Israel, the south of Israel, and then the Transjordan. Philistines aren't mentioned very much. But when you open 1 Samuel, we don't really hear about these other people. It's the Philistines. Now, the Philistines are the descendants of the Phoenicians, okay? And so these are the descendants of the Mycenaeans, the Minoans on the island of Crete. They are the sea peoples. They are the Vikings before the Vikings. In fact, there is no historical evidence whatsoever that Vikings wore horned helmets. Did you know that? But guess who did? The Philistines. They wore horn helmets, and they also wore horsehair. You ever seen those old movies of Romans, right? And there's guys wearing that horsehair, right? You know what I'm talking about? One of the first people that was? The Philistines, right? The Phoenicians, the Minoans, the Cretans, where these come from. So they're the ones who start that. And so they're starting to go into the interior. And so they've been on the coastline for a couple of hundred years. But their sights have been on Egypt, on the Hittites, Greece, Italy, North Africa. But now you've got 5 cities. And so these individuals aren't going to have kind of an empire until a couple hundred years later. That empire is going to be in Carthage. Anybody heard of Carthage before? Who do the Carthaginians fight? The Romans. Almost beat them, right? Hannibal actually did beat them, okay? So Carthage is a Philistine or a Phoenician empire. They almost strangle Rome in the cradle, right? They fight them for over 150 years in the Punic Wars. So these Philistines from these 5 city-states on the coast are now starting to make incursions into the interior, okay? And so these are seafaring peoples. Their cities are on the coast, and they're basically using their boats to travel north to go attack the Hittites or to travel south and attack the Egyptians. But now in 1177, after the Egyptians beat the Philistines by Ramses the Great, now all of a sudden they stopped trying to invade Egypt. They actually invaded Egypt and overthrew them for a couple of years. They actually turned inward to go conquer the interior of what we call Israel today, right? Or what was Israel back then. So the elders go and ask Samuel for a king, okay? Samuel, later on, Samuel was born in chapter 1, but a few chapters later, like in 1 Samuel chapter 8, Samuel has established himself as the priest, the prophet, and the judge. He's the closest thing they've had to a legitimate leader in a long time. And the elders go and ask Samuel for a king because the Philistines are starting to attack. And these, as of right now, are the best warriors in the Mediterranean world. They're the best. And the Israelites are awful. Right. And so they don't stand a chance. And so they go to Samuel and say, we need a king who can raise an army and fight against the Philistines. And Samuel says, you don't need a king. You need to repent and turn to God. Right. And so God tells Samuel that the people have not rejected him, but have rejected God. Right. And so Samuel tells them that if they get a king, the king is going to oppress them. He's going to take their daughters and their sons, going to take their lands, their livestock. The king is not the answer. But eventually God tells Samuel to give them a king. And so what is the livelihood of these individuals at this time? Very agriculture-based, livestock, fishery, and those types of things. And so the major concern is that everyone is proved to be lacking. The people have elders. The elders are no good, right? They're just not. They're no good. They've had priests. The priests are no good. They've had judges. The judges are no good, right? And so you have to sympathize, I think, with the people during this time frame, because for 400 years, they've been the kicking post of just about everybody around them, with a few years here and there whenever a judge has been able to keep the enemies at bay. And those judges don't judge the entirety of Israel. It's usually just a section of Israel. So you may have a judge who has pushed the Ammonites in the north, but you still may have the Moabites, the Midianites in the south who are oppressing Israelites. So there is no real time whenever the entire nation is free from oppression. So they've had elders, they have priests, they have judges, but it's not been successful. And so Samuel tells them a king will do no better. Only God can save them. And instead of repenting en masse to God, they decide, no, we want a king. Samuel says, no, you need to repent in sackcloth and ashes, and God will deliver you. He'll beat the Philistines. And they say, no. We want a king. We want a king, right? And so there's this heavy canonization that's taken place over the last 350 years. The Bible tells us that there's a lot of idolatry that is taking place. The Bible tells us that they've been intermarrying with the Canaanites. We see they've adopted Canaanite customs. And so there's this heavy Canaanite influence that has occurred, which includes idolatry. And so the nation is not living as they should. And so now it's getting serious, okay? The Philistines are the most powerful group of people in the Mediterranean world at this time. Now, this is important for you to understand if you're going to understand what's taking place. The Philistines are a very loose confederation of city-states. There is no king of the Philistines, okay? The closest thing that you can think of is probably like the Greek city-states. If you look at history, you'll realize that in the Greek city-states, you have the Peloponnese in the south, which has like Sparta and Corinth, and then you'll have those like Thebes and Macedonia and Athens, right? And all these different city-states. And each city-state has its own king, unless you're Athens and you kind of have a democracy, right? And so they're just as liable to fight with each other as they are to fight together against somebody else. And even when you have people who invade, like the Persians, sometimes you have Greek city-states that actually fight with the Persians against the other Greek city-states, right? And so that's the exact same thing here that we're talking about this. So the Philistines have this extensive trade network across the world, okay? They're the most powerful people in the world, but they're not uniformed. It's not like all the Philistines are going to come together and attack Israel. It's not going to happen because you have Philistine city-states in North Africa. You got Philistine city-states in Egypt. You've got Philistine city-states in modern-day Turkey, which is called Anatolia, right? You've got Philistine city-states in southern Greece and southern Italy. And so if you can see on this map, and I realize that it may not be very easy to see, and I want to give credit to Stephen Rudd, who made this map. But if you can see this, you can see the different incursions that the Philistines had. So they're coming from the island of Crete, from that Minoan, Mycenaean, Phoenician, right? So Philistine, think Phoenician, right? And you've got groups. They're like Vikings, right? They got a group that goes south and invades Egypt and actually overthrows the Egyptian pharaoh for a couple of years. You've got groups that are going north to the Peloponnesian coast of Greece, right? That's where Sparta is going to be. The Laconians, right? You've got those who are going up into Anatolia, right? And so if you didn't know this, Anatolia is named after Anatolia, right? It's modern day Turkey. Did you know that? It's been called Anatolia forever. The Turks got there. So we should call it Anatolia. Anyways, so this is Asia, right? The 7 churches of Asia, right? Modern day Turkey. This is where this is, okay? The Hittite Empire. So before the 1200s, the 2 major empires in the world, okay, is Egypt and the Hittites. The earliest historical battle that we have record of is a battle that happens I believe it's at Carchemish, between the Egyptians and the Hittites. Okay, the Hittites are in Anatolia, okay, what is called Asia in the Bible. So you've got these two major empires in the early to late Bronze Age, which is the Hittites and the Egyptians. The Phoenicians, the Philistines, the Sea Peoples come in and they take out the Hittite Empire totally and put the Egyptian Empire on its heels. These guys are legit, okay? They got iron chariots. They're warriors, right? When David goes up to Saul and says, I'm going to fight against Goliath, he says, these people are people of war. And they've been people of war since their youth, okay? These are fighters, okay? These are the Sea Peoples that is mentioned in Egyptian writings that go back to the 12th and 13th centuries. In 1177, they are pushed back and defeated by the Egyptians, Ramses the Great. And so you've got the Phoenicians, they attack from land and sea. And so you've got the Phoenicians coming from the island of Crete and invading Egypt to take it over. They've already taken over the Hittites. The only people who are left are the Egyptians, okay? So they come from Crete, they come from over in Carthage, and they come from Israel, okay? This three-pronged attack, okay? So these Philistine kings get together and try to defeat the Egyptians, and they almost do it. But Ramses the Great, Ramses II, he is able to beat them back, okay? And so in 1177, after he beats them back, those in Carthage go back to Carthage, and those in Crete go back to Crete, and those who are on the coast of Israel go back there, right? These are the 5 Philistine cities, Ashkelon, Gaza, those types of places, right? And so, but now they got to go somewhere. Where are they going to go? Can't go south because the Egyptians just beat them. They go inland against the Israelites. That's why we find out they haven't been talked about much. They're in the Judges. But now when 1 Samuel opens up in 1120, the Philistines are making incursions into the interior of Israel. Right? For hundreds of years beforehand, they haven't really cared about Israel, right? Because they're trying to take care of the wealth that's up in Anatolia and down in Egypt. But once they get beat by the Egyptians, they got to go somewhere else. So they decide to go inland, and that's where we find ourselves. But could you imagine being an Israelite and the Phoenicians, these Philistines, these Sea Peoples have conquered or almost conquered every empire in the Mediterranean world, and now they're coming after you? Could you imagine how scary that would be? They beat the Hittites and almost beat the Egyptians. You don't have a king. You don't have a standing army. You got nothing, right? Can you imagine the fear that they have when the Philistines start gearing up for war and start making incursions into the interior? I think I can understand why they went to Samuel and said, Samuel, please give us a king. Give us something. Give us anything, right? And so I don't think we do a really good job of understanding the sheer terror that is taking place in Israel at this time, right? So it's like, well, they should just listen to Samuel. They should listen to God. Well, that's true, right? And I totally agree with you. But it's really easy to say that, 3,000 years on this side, where we're not worried about the Philistines coming in, killing and abusing our wives and children, right? So it's a little bit easier for us to kind of have that idea. And so 1 and 2 Samuel is important because it gives us the last 2 judges, Eli and Samuel, and it gives us the first 2 kings, which is Saul and David. And so you have 1 and 2 Samuel and also 1 Chronicles really as kind of this bridge, right? That's kind of getting us from the time of the judges, the time of the monarchy, and especially the Davidic monarchy. And so they had become, the Phoenicians had become greatly feared throughout the Mediterranean world. They are mentioned by the Hittites, the Egyptians, also in Canaanite literature. They're actually also mentioned in the Iliad by Homer. Anybody ever heard of the Iliad, where Homer talks about the fall of Troy, right? Guess who's mentioned in there as fighters that helped defeat Troy? The Philistines, right? So Homer talks about them. Like I said before, hundreds of years later, they would be centered in Carthage and almost destroy the Roman Republic. And so the nation of Israel feels like it is under a very serious threat of annihilation and being conquered. And so this is a very bleak and dark time. The overall feeling in the nation is extremely negative. The people are motivated by despair and negativity, and they're looking for a change. And oftentimes, when you feel like there's no leadership, there's no central government, there's nobody who's taking charge, historically, what do people look for? What do they look for? I'm up here, but it's still Bible class. What are they looking for? a strong man, right? So when you look at through history, when you find times of chaos and disarray, people are looking for a strong man, right? Somebody who's big and talks a big game and who can rally the troops, right? And so that's what they're looking for. Now, the Israelites have the biggest man on the block, right? It's God. They don't want that, right? They want an actual man who's going to lead them. That's why the nation accepts Saul, right? He's a big man. He's a head taller than everybody else. So he kind of has that persona, right? And so, so several things take place, and I should have had a slide for this, and I'm sorry, but there are several critical historical things that take place in 1st and 2nd Samuel. We'll talk about these during this class, and that is the downfall of the Aaronic priesthood and the line of Ithamar. And so there's been this line of Ithamar ever since they've come into the land of promise, but that line is going to be snuffed out. It talks about the Levitical judges and how they do not honor their job. It talks about the transition from the Israelites being under judges to being under kings. It talks about the events of Israel's first two kings, Saul and David. It talks about the establishment of Jerusalem as Israel's kingdom, capital city. And so during this time frame, right, Jerusalem is not a Israelite city at this point. It's still being held by the Jebusites. And so during the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we're going to be having the conquest of Jerusalem, and that being the capital city. It documents the establishment of the Davidic dynasty as the sole legitimate dynasty of Israel. It provides details about the life of David, Israel's most famous king, and it also documents the events that caused this growing rift between Israel and Judah, right? So after the death of Solomon, Israel and Judah split into two kingdoms. The interesting thing is you can see that doesn't start after Solomon's death. You can actually see, even in the life of Saul and David, there's already a rift that's forming, right? I mean, when was the Civil War in this country? I remember 1861, right? 1861, 1865. But if you go back and you read the writings of the founding fathers in 1760s, guess what? You can already see a rift between the northern and southern states. You can already see them arguing and already seeing them threatening to take their ball and go home, or even to fight, right? It takes about 100 years for it to finally wind up into a war, a civil war. But if you go back and you read Madison and Jefferson and those types of guys, you can already start to see the splits taking place, right? Israel and Judah don't split until after the death of Solomon. But if you look at 1st and 2nd Samuel, what do you see? They're already ripping apart. It's already taking place, right? It's not just something that happens after the death of Solomon. It's happened during the life of Saul and David, right? And so there's some key themes in this study. Number one is government. And so basically the entire writing is linked to who is the legitimate ruler of God's people, right? And so you see that from the very beginning of 1 Samuel all the way to the end, right? When David's on his deathbed, who's going to be the next king, right? So 1st and 2nd Samuel, you never leave this idea of government. Who is the legitimate ruler of God's people? Number two, you have great character development. If you've read ancient literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh or, the Iliad and the Odyssey and those types of writings, you're talking about events that are taking place in 1st and 2nd Samuel that is older, right, than those writings, or at least those writings that we have. And so, but there is no better character development in ancient literature, right? And sometimes people just dismiss that because it's the Bible, right? Okay, yeah, it's the Bible. It has the best character development of any ancient literature, bar none, right? You get this insight into Samuel, into Saul, into David, into Jonathan, right? And you see this character development that reads like a modern story, right? You can go read ancient literature. It's nowhere on par with what we see in the Old Testament, especially in 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's just not. And so excellent character development, really engaging, right, and inviting. You can see yourself in the main characters. But then number three, it talks about God and his kingdom, right? And this is important because this translates even to God's kingdom today in the new covenant, right? And so what is the requirements to be a part of God's kingdom? Right? It takes obedience. It takes a relationship with him. And it takes an honoring of the covenant that he has made with us. That same thing is true of the New Testament, right? What does it cost to be a part of God's kingdom today? obedience, a relationship with him through his son, and an honoring of the covenant, right? You go and you read Hebrews chapter 8 and 9, and what does it talk about? It talks about the new covenant, right? And so that Christ is the mediator of a better covenant. So we don't think about covenant a whole lot, but you see the pitfalls that take place with Israel and some of the characters in this study, those are also warnings for us under the kingdom of the New Testament too. And so thank you guys so much. Anybody have any questions about any of the things that we discussed or talked about tonight in our opening introduction? Cliff?
I was just wondering, Palestinians, people from Palestine, is that any relation to people from the Philistines today?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Excellent question. The answer is no. And so in 605 BC, the Babylonians come in. The Syrians come in 722, but the Assyrians leave the Philistine city-states, and they also leave Judah in the south. But when the Babylonians come in 605, Nebuchadnezzar actually destroys the Philistine city-states and takes their people off into captivity to Babylon. And he actually strikes a deal with Judah, right? And so you see this, and we'll read this later on, but Nebuchadnezzar is actually coming in to destroy, and God gives the Judeans some more time. But in 605, the same year he takes Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego into captivity, he destroys the Philistine city-states on the coastline. And so the rest of the Philistines at this time, they all kind of migrate to Carthage and to Spain, lower Spain. They go all the way across to like Morocco and even like the northern part of North Africa. And so they kind of center their empire there from Carthage, almost in Egypt, all the way around the Mediterranean, up to Spain, and almost all the way over to like modern day southern France and stuff like that. And so, but as far as their holdings in like Greece, the Greeks kick them out. Their holdings in Anatolia, they pretty much get kicked out of Anatolia by the Greeks too. So you have this expansion of the Greek city-states, and also the Romans too in southern Italy. And so you see their holdings shrink and shift to the west, basically. And so there is no relation to modern Palestinians to the Philistines. Now, when Hadrian destroys, so there's 3 Jewish revolts, right? There's one in 66 to 70, there's one in 113, and there's one in 135 to 133 to 135. The 3rd Jewish revolt, Hadrian comes in and he removes all of the Jews out of Israel/Palestine. And it was called Judea, right? I mean, if you go and you read the Gospels, it's called Judea. And so he forces all the Jews out because this is the 3rd war they've started in 70 years. And as a mark of shame against them, he renames it. And so he gives them the name Palestinia, which is after the Phoenicians or the Philistines that used to be there. And so, but yes, there is no, and there's been lots of like DNA testing and stuff like that, but the modern Palestinians are Arabs. And so they're not related to the Philistines. So great. That's actually a really good question. Good. Anybody else have a comment or a question? Okay. Good. All right. So next week we'll get into the text. And so hopefully we'll be able to have a little more exciting dialogue and discussion over the stories. And I would like to say I'm sorry for nerding out on the history, but I'll be honest with you. I'm not sorry at all. And so and hopefully you like it. If not, that's a you problem. I'm just playing. I'm just kidding. I have a fever, so I can say what I want. I don't know what I'm saying. So anyways, but thank you guys so much. We'll go ahead and we'll close in a prayer. Thank y'all. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day and for all the many blessings you've given to us. We're so thankful for this congregation of your people that meets here at Chapel Hill. We ask that you would bless each family. We know there are many within our number who are hurting with recent loss of family and friends. We also know there are those who are under the weather and sick with various illnesses. And dear Heavenly Father, and some who are just going through the daily struggles of life, we just pray that you'd be with each one of us, that you would help us to be positive, to focus on the good, to set our sights on things that are above and not the things that are below. Heavenly Father, please help us to be good students of your word and strive to apply the things that we read in your word to our own lives and to share it with others. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.